Gerald is the only one who said he wanted to go through a book. He's the only one that named a book. We're going to try and start out going through the book of Exodus. And so today is going to be an introduction of going into that book. I think it'll be fun and exciting for a little bit of a change. And then there's only so many messages I can preach on where people complain in a row. So I don't know what we're going to get into, but
I think we're going to read a lot about tabernacles.
yeah.
Over and over.
Yeah, that's right. Now, I want you to guys, I hope you guys enjoyed services this morning. I hope you guys had a good afternoon and was just able to think a little bit about, you know, our country. Obviously, tomorrow is really Memorial Day. And so, you know, we are blessed to be in this country, even in this, with it being in the situation it's in. And a lot of it we're going to be, or that we're going through right now, let me tell you, is what the Israelites are getting ready to go through in Egypt. Okay, so some of the things that I was studying are very fitting for our day and age today. Very fitting, because we're going to find a people that were living, not doing anything wrong. And yet a Pharaoh came who did not know Joseph. And he said, you know what? I don't like those people. Let's get rid of them. And he had a different belief system. And he didn't even accept the God of Joseph. And so we see some things that will happen. And so, God is on the move. And he's carrying out his plan. And we're going to see that in the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is the second book in the Septuagint. We understand that Moses is the one who wrote the book. Exodus. Anyone know, what does Exodus mean?
To leave.
It means the exit, right? The exiting of Egypt. And so the first half of the book of Exodus is all about God freeing them from their bondage. Okay, which is very key. And so I'm just going to tell you, I just kind of titled this, I don't even know if it's really a title, but I just kind of titled this as Setting the Stage for a Redeemer. The people have to come to the point where they realize they need a Redeemer. And we're going to kind of look at some things that have happened. We know that there's been about a 400-year stretch from the time that they moved into Egypt to the time that Joseph died. They were taken into captivity, and then Moses finally takes them out. There's a stretch of about 430 years. That's quite a while to be in Egypt. And you have to remember, up until the time they were taken into bondage, they were very prosperous. Everything was going very well for them. And it very well could be that, you know, when everything is going good, just as I preached before, sometimes our blessings can become a curse. Because we forget to pray every day, because everything's good.
We take it for
We
granted.
start to take the things for granted. Yeah, we got good crops. Cattle's all producing. Kids are all healthy. Everyone's, you know, and we kind of forget who is really in charge and who's running things. And it only takes 1 or 2 generations to completely forget God. And we're seeing that in our own nation. And so there's some things that are happening that why God allows the nation of Israel to be taken into captivity. We know that Moses, we're going to find out that he's going to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt, and he's going to lead them for 40 years. But he's not going to do that until he's 80 years old, before he takes those people out of Egypt. And so we're going to find that. Egypt was a very thriving and strong nation. And part of that is because of the blessing that God was using the nation of Egypt for, as the nation of Israel is growing within that territory of Egypt. But Egypt at this time is going to be very, very powerful, very strong, stronger than they've ever been. Okay, and part of that is, once again, because God had told Abraham in his promise, any nation that will bless you, I'm going to bless them. And so not only was Israel, the nation of Israel, growing and multiplying, but Egypt was growing in power, in money. They were growing, and so they are very, very well known now, okay? And so that's kind of what we're walking into as we go into the book of Exodus. Remember that God had promised Abraham that through him there would come a nation that would multiply into a great nation. We're going to see that unfolding, but also we saw that part of the promise that God revealed to Abraham is that there's going to be a time where the people of Israel, the nation that's going to come from you, Abraham, they're going to be taken into captivity, and they're going to be taken out of the land of Canaan, and they're going to be held as in bondage for a while. But God says, but don't you worry, I'm going to bring them out of that. But there will be a time period that they will have to be in captivity. And so we know that was part of the promise. That was no real surprise for those who understood the promise that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and then also to Jacob. So in order to go ahead and get started, let me just open us up in prayer, and we're just going to try and work our way through this first chapter. And just remember the theme, which is so fitting when you understand, and it goes exactly what I mentioned this morning with the law. God saved his people, and then he gave them the law. There's a reason for that. Because people need to realize they need a redeemer. And that fits right in with what we're going to see next week with why is it that God gave them the law? Because people need to realize they need a redeemer. And if they never need a redeemer, they're never going to be saved. And so people need to realize what sin is and the weight of sin and why it's so important that God's wrath be poured out fully on that sin. And so that's what we're going to be looking at next week. But also, we're going to be coming to light over the next few weeks as we're going to be studying some of that very stuff that's going to be taking place here. Let's go ahead and open up in prayer, and then we'll get started here. Dear Lord Jesus, I just thank you once again for just allowing us another opportunity, God, where we can just gather together with brothers and sisters and just read from your word and worship you in song and in word. God, I thank you for just allowing us to be in this nation. I thank you for those who bravely and faithfully fought for this nation in what they believed, in trusting you and the freedoms that you said we ought to have as a free people. God, I thank you for using my brothers and sisters that have gone on before me and bringing this nation to the place that it is today, where I can have the freedoms I have. God, I just ask that you just continue to work in this church, work in the Church of America, God, and just bring us to your attention. Just place in all of our hearts and our minds that you come first. It's not our luxuries, it's not our rights, but it's you working, God, and you are calling, and you are trying to bring people and draw people to you. And so, God, I just ask that you use the Church of America to be a witness for you. And God, I know that you can use this little church right here in our community. You can use us to make an impact on this nation and even around the world if you want. God, we just have to be willing and obedient. God, I ask that you just bless us for this time that we've gathered here tonight, as so many others have found other things to do, and coming to church is not on their list at all of priority. And God, I just ask that you bless those of us that are here, and just bless this time. Help us to enjoy our time together, and may we learn from your word something that you would have for us. Thank you once again. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So let's just jump right in and look and see what all is going to happen here. Really, this first chapter is kind of giving us a setting. Remember, we're looking at the book of Exodus is always referring to God in his plan is establishing people need a redeemer. That's what it's all about. The whole book of Exodus is about people need a redeemer. So let's look in verse 1. It says, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man and his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those were descendants of Jacob. All who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Okay? So we see all the tribes of Israel that are listed there. Now we also see it just makes mention of Joseph was already there in Egypt, and we know that the other tribes that were not mentioned there are Ephraim and Manasseh. Remember, Jacob blessed Ephraim and Manasseh and made them tribes, not Joseph, because Joseph was not part of that blessing. But by doing that, basically Joseph got 2 portions of the blessing, because there are 2 tribes out of his name. Okay? So time has passed, what we just read there, and all of that. Joseph has passed away. Those brothers that we just read their names, they're no longer alive. This is lots of time has gone by since then. Okay, and it says all those people that first moved into Egypt, they're gone. They've passed on. But it says in that time, while they have passed on, their tribes, their families have multiplied and multiplied and multiplied into very large groups of people, tribes, really. Okay? And it says that the land was filled with the Hebrews. Now, I'll tell you this also, we're not just talking about the people. Okay, we're still talking about their livestock, and everything else they have has multiplied like you can't imagine. Okay, because they are in the land of Goshen, right? The most fertile land, best grazing land there is, sheep, cattle, donkeys, camels. They had the works. Okay, and that goes into one of the reasons why it brings some attention to Pharaoh and what he's seeing, okay? So it says that the land was filled with the Hebrews. Is it possible, I wrote here in my notes, that things were going so good and had gone so good for so long that the people were forgetting the promise of God? Is that possible? Absolutely. Absolutely it is. I think that's exactly what has happened here in our own nation. People have forgotten all that has gone on. We even saw it, we read in Peter on Wednesday night, where Peter says, man, there are those of you as Christians, and these were young Christians that ran away during the persecution, and Peter says, some of you have forgotten what it was that Jesus did for you on the cross. And because you get a little persecution, you guys are getting all huffy and throwing in the towel and saying, well, this isn't for me. And Peter says, if you kept your eye on Jesus, you wouldn't have forgotten what all he went through. And yet at the same time, I think this is part of what's going on here, is that they've lived in this blessing for so long that they've kind of forgotten the promise. Now, we're going to see in reference, I think by the time that Moses comes onto the scene, I'll be honest with you, I think most people were not really even believing the promise from God. I mean, when you think about the couple hundred years of slavery that they go through, I don't think they were thinking, yeah, you know what, I'm proud to be in the family and worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Most of them were saying, I don't even believe that. That was so many generations ago, and we've not seen any evidence of that at all. And yet you look around at what we have today, we have people complaining about some of the most ridiculous things that offend them or hurt their rights. And we look at it and we say, have you gotten so spoiled? Have you forgotten? One thing that I thought was so great as I was reading this first chapter from J. Vernon McGee's commentary, he said, you know what really threw me for a loop is he said, as I sat down one day and I was talking with my own daughter and her husband, and they were making light and really didn't understand anything about the Great Depression. And he said, and I as a young boy grew up through that. And he said, and here I thought in my own mind, I went through it personally, and yet my own child has forgotten what our nation went through in the Great Depression. And he said, if it can happen that easily, how quickly can a nation turn from God and lose sight of God whenever we're blessed? He said, my daughter did not know the things that I went through as a young boy and what my parents went through trying to feed me as a young boy going through that Great Depression. And he said, and we did everything we could to make sure that my daughter and my kids were fed, and we took care of them and sent them to school and paid for their clothing and paid for all those things. And yet my daughter, as a grown adult, said, well, was the Great Depression really that big of a deal? Now, this is J. Vernon McGee, very well-known preacher. But he said, you think about this. And he said, and I sat them down and explained to them in great detail the Great Depression and what took place in our nation. And they walked away having a whole new set of respect for the people that went through that. I think that's kind of what's going on here with the Israelites, these Hebrew people living in Goshen for such a long time. Look in verse 8, it says, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now this is very interesting. Very interesting. You will have to say, wait, time out. How can you have someone be a pharaoh, a newly appointed pharaoh, over all of Egypt, and he does not know Joseph? You know why? Because he was not of the original family line of Egypt. There were different groups of people, and we know that for about 5 or 6 generations in a row, there was one group of people, and they were the HYKSOS group or whatever, but there were many, many pharaohs that came through that group. And then right here, what we have is we have a new overturning, basically, of power. We have a new kingdom that comes within the kingdom of Egypt. This is an outside group of people. They were in the kingdom of Egypt, but this king comes in, and we even have his name. Okay, his name was Amos, A-M-O-S-E the first. And he took the throne as Pharaoh, but he was not from the original family line of the several generations that had taken over before. And what he did was, when he took over, he ran out all of those families. They wiped them out. They were no longer in the nation of Egypt. And he basically reestablished the gods, the way the worship was set up there, everything. And that's why we're going to see he even made the Israelites build new temples for different gods and different things, because when he came in, it was a whole new set of rules, basically. So that makes sense as why this new Pharaoh comes in, takes over, and has no knowledge of Joseph, has no understanding of who these Israelites are, and has no understanding of the promise that God had told the nation, if you bless the nation of Israel, I'll bless you. No understanding of that at all. So, he became Pharaoh by running out the other known royalty families. One point that I saw one commentator made here, and I think is so important, is that how is it that this man, growing up within the kingdom of Egypt, how is it he had never heard about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? How is it that he had never heard the message? Because no one told him. Isn't that interesting? Now, we understand that this is a vast territory. Okay, this guy came out of a territory. This wasn't like, here in Springfield. No, we're talking major territories. Okay, and basically this kingdom, this little group of kingdom, soldiers come in and they take over, main downtown, Egypt. Okay, where all the pyramids are. That's what they did. And then they pushed all those other guys out. Okay, just like we know the Israelites lived in Goshen. Well, good grief, Goshen is like from here to Arkansas away, even farther. Okay, it was not like, Joseph was driving down to Goshen every other day on the horse and chariot. Okay, this was a long way. There was a vast empire. Okay, many people. And so one point that we see here is that why was it that no one shared with him?
He probably didn't want to hear it.
Well, that's one point. One point, he worships another god. My gods are sufficient for me. I don't need your God. That's one point. But what a great picture for you and I today to say, you know what? In just a couple of generations of us failing to get out and witness, look at what's happened. And I've shared this example with you all before in other churches. You know, in the 50s and 60s, whether you were saved or not, it was just kind of a known thing that on Sunday you went to church. That was just kind of a known thing. And what happened is, and you even go back into 30s and 40s, okay, if you weren't going to church, people would say, well, why aren't you going to church? We're all going. You know, just you and your wife, just hop on the wagon and we'll all go. And we'll bring you back by. You know what happened is the church, for a while, when we were booming, when we were at our strongest, in the 40s and the 50s, we got complacent. And we got used to the fact that people just came. And so when people just came, we didn't go out. And when we quit going out, then we started, after a while, we started thinking, I wonder why Sister Sue doesn't come. And instead of going and asking her or inviting her, we just pray. God, just do something in her life to get her here. God, just do something. And then eventually we quit praying for that. And then what happened is over time, we have more people that aren't coming than are coming. And I can tell you, I've been in some churches where I've asked them, if you have invited someone to church within the last 3 months, raise your hand. Okay, if you've invited someone within the last 6 months, raise your hand. If you've invited someone within the last year, raise your hand. If you've went and knocked on someone's door within the last 5 years, you'd be surprised how many people were honest. Couldn't raise their hands. And then we wonder why we're at where we're at. Because we haven't invited. We haven't been going out. We haven't been sharing. We're here every week, and that's a great testimony. But our testimony, I can tell you, the outside world is not looking to see who made it to church on Sunday night. They're not here. They're at the lake. Right?
Or ball games.
Or at the ball games, yeah. Or other places. Or grilling, cooking out, right?
At the lake.
So, yeah. So, verse 9, it says, he said, so he does not know Joseph, verse 9. And he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we are. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happened in the event of war. Remember what I just said? What had he had just done? He had just taken over, right? Let it happen, and happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemy and fight against us, and so go out of the land. What was his concern? Hey, look, I've just moved in, and I pushed out all the other leadership. I've gotten rid of all of the empire that was leading. Now I'm the one in charge. There's enough Israelites, they could have a coup against me. And if some of these other families decide, you know what, we're going to come back in and we're going to try to take over the throne again. If those Israelites joined them, they could take out all of Egypt. There's more Israelites than there are Egyptians. This is a little bit of a concern for me. And not only that, not only was his concern that they might come in and overthrow him, but what else did he say? That they would leave the land. See, God was blessing the nation, and the Israelites were building buildings. Now, we know the pyramids were already put in there. Okay, the pyramids were already there when the Israelites moved in. And we're going to see that they come in and they build Ramses, and they build a couple other... The Israelites built some of these towers and different worship areas to some of the different gods under this first Pharaoh, under this Pharaoh. Think, how would you like to do that? Think of you as a Christian being forced to go out and make an altar to a God that you don't even serve. Think how hard that would be. Right? So anyway, but he says, we can't afford to have these people leave. I mean, as of right now, if they just decided to pack up and leave tomorrow, they're gone. And you know what? There goes the beef. There goes the beef industry. There goes the housing industry that we've got them all working on. There goes everything that we had going for us. You know what that means? We're going to have to get calluses on our hands again, gentlemen. And we don't want that. So we're going to have to figure out a way that we can kind of bring them in, start harnessing them in. But we can't do it all at once. And so they did it in sections. They didn't make them slaves. They didn't just go in and make Israel slaves overnight. First, he sends out taskmasters. He starts giving them certain jobs, and they start having people that are over them. And little by little, they just kept taking it and taking it and taking it until eventually they're complete slaves. But it wasn't an overnight thing because they were so numerous. They could have overtaken Egypt. And is that not exactly what we look at here in America? How Satan has just taken out God out of school, and then prayer out of school. And then we let in abortion, and we let in this, and we let in that, and we take God out of that, and we take God out of that, little by little. To where eventually we look around and we have presidents and leading officials that say, well, whatever we once were, we're no longer a Christian nation. And in many ways it is true, because it's crept in from every different area. Now, it's not saying we don't have good Christian people here. We do. And our foundations, what they were based on, we still see the remnants of it, but they're being taken away. They're being pulled out.
It's like it took one woman to get God out of school.
Yeah.
And 350,000 signatures could not get him back in.
Yeah, isn't that sad? Isn't that sad? Yeah.
Even her own son couldn't change that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Look in verse 11, it says, therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. Okay, so a couple of things that are going on here. The Hebrew people had taskmasters set over them. Taskmasters are basically those guys that we see, or we would recognize them basically as they weren't the slave owners. They were the ones that carried the whips and rode the horses out there on the plantations to make sure that the slaves were getting the job done to the best of their ability. And that's what the taskmasters were. And they would ride out there and make sure that all those Hebrew people were doing everything they could and making every brick just right and making every rock just right as they were building the road, as they were making the buildings, because it says they were building supply buildings and supply cities. You know what those were? Those were armor bunks. Those were for the army, for soldiers, for the Egyptian soldiers. They were making these big supply buildings in warehouses. Excuse me. Military bunks. It says they made Pithom. That was a altar to the solar gods. The Egyptian taskmasters had Israel build Pithom, and then Ramesses. This is also a god, okay, an altar that was built to the gods, and it was down in the southern region. Very interesting. We find that almost in the area of Goshen. Isn't that interesting? So you have one god that was built at the top of the kingdom, one that was built at the bottom worship areas. Okay, is what this Egyptian Pharaoh wanted. And it just happens that that bottom one was not far from where Israel was stationed at. Interesting, because later on we see a Ramses come out of, a name of a Pharaoh named Ramesses. Okay, well, at that time he wouldn't have been around when this was being built, okay, because this was built, and then we still have another couple hundred years before Moses comes onto the scene, okay? There's some time period going on through here. So, look in verse 12, it says, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. The harder the taskmasters drove them and threatened them, and really what it is it was almost as if they became racist overnight. That's what Pharaoh told the Egyptians. You see an Israelite, a Hebrew, I want you to treat them like they are scum. You turn your nose up to them, you talk down to them, you treat them with disrespect, because they need to feel like they are under us, because if not, they could overpower us very easily. Okay, so there was a method in this, but what we see is he's using basically racism as a means to quiet this nation that is growing. But the Bible says the more that they were mistreated, the more God blessed them and multiplied them. And so this is how we know that this was over long periods of time, because this doesn't just happen in 1 or 2 days. Okay, this is, 20 years go by, and he's saying, wait a minute, we have been giving them more and more orders. Now we're doing whips. We're giving them backlashes, even if they look me in the eye. Used to be just if they didn't get enough done, but now they don't even look at us. They're not allowed to talk. And the more that we beat them, the more that we try to get them into submission, the more kids they're having. How is this possible? And it was driving him nuts. Look at what it says. It says, verse 13, so the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. Okay? And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. Okay? So, every job that they were given, every task, every day, it says that was given to them with rigor. That means harsh judgment.
Reckon these taskmasters wore brown shirts.
Brown shirts? Probably. Said UPS on, no, maybe not that, but, huh?
Nazi.
Oh, yeah, Nazi. Oh, okay, yeah. I was just thinking with FedEx, but yeah.
Your experience.
Yeah, that's just what I've experienced, yeah. But, yeah.
Not your drill sergeant.
Yeah, no. But, yeah, it was, everything they were given, they were treated very harshly with a very harsh judgment. And like I said, it came across basically as just a racist kind of hatred towards these people. That's how they were treated. In verse 15 it says, then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of the midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. Now, this is very interesting. We see the same thing going on today. Okay, this is what is called abortion. They were to check these infants, and the minute they were born, if they could find out if it was a boy before the infant was even fully breached, kill it. That's what it's saying here. Okay?
China was almost like that with killing the girls, because they was only allowed one child and a son. Everybody else.
Right. Yeah, for population reason. Yep. So Pharaoh says, listen, he talks to these midwives. Now, there's a couple interesting things here. It says the tribes are multiplying faster and faster, and so Pharaoh tells the leader of these midwives, these Hebrew midwives, to take the lives of the newborn babies. And we see the names of two of them. One of them is Shiphrah, which means beauty, and Puah, which means splendor. Now, these would be Hebrew midwives, and you have to remember, there were hundreds of thousands. I mean, the commentaries say there were probably at this time between 500,000 to 600,000 men alone. So at that time, can you imagine how many women were having babies? So these two women were in charge over all the other midwives in that land of Goshen. Okay, and so they would basically be kind of like the head doctor, physicians, call me if you need any help, but otherwise, I've got 500 other midwives that work for us. Okay, and so that's really what they were. Okay, and so Pharaoh tells them, this is the game plan. We're going to take the lives of any infant boy. I want you to let all the other midwives know this is what we're to do. Okay? And when we see this, is this not just another great picture, just outright bold from Satan, who is trying to end that line that would bring the Messiah. We see this over and over and over. We see the very same thing happen with Herod. The very same thing. Kill the boys. Kill the boys. Now, if the midwives had said, yes, we will follow that, we will obey what the Pharaoh says, then you know what? That could have been a drastic end to the nation of Israel. But they didn't do it. And it's very, very interesting what we see here, because they don't do anything wrong. They're not dishonest. But God has his hand in the plan. And these women were faithful and obeyed God, and he blesses them for this. Okay, look at what it says here in verse 17. It says, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children. Okay? It says they were afraid of God. They feared God. Not a fear of, oh man, I'm afraid of God in the sense of, I don't want to be around him when the guy's around me. You know, when God comes around, I feel creeped out, you know, and I don't know what he's going to do. No, they feared him. It was a reverence fear. It was, this is Creator God. This is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am not going to go against God's people, because we know that we are God's people. And we are not going to start taking out the boys of God's people. That we know for sure. And it says, I mean, they had a choice to make. These women had a choice to make. Okay, do I follow God and what God leads, or do I obey the authorities of a pagan king? What do I do? Now, what they did was they followed the word of God. They followed God's leading. They were obedient to God, and that's what we need to do even in times like this. You know, there will come a time, let me tell you, should the time ever come when, you know, our government, or we have another nation that tries to come in and take over us, let me tell you, I'll be first one in arms. I'll be there. Because that's our right. God says we're to protect our nation. There are certain things that we are to do. If our government was to turn on the people and try and come in and say, we're coming into your homes, I'll tell you what, Ron calls me and says, you know what, they're at my door and they're trying to come in. You know what I'm saying? I'm on my way. Because that's our right. And God, that is living according to God's word. That is honoring to God. But until that time comes, we need to be faithfully living for the Lord, being obedient to the Lord, being in prayer. That's what we need to be doing, right? Following God's guidance.
They're already doing it.
Well, yeah.
We got Congress people that are backing Hamas against Israel.
Right. Yeah. And and what we may see coming into our nation in the near future could be, you know, pretty eye-opening for a lot of people.
You know, because they knew about God, that he was creator, I think they realized they was not going to take the life because he created them, you know.
Right.
Too, not just because, you know, so, I mean, that was different in the beliefs than the Pharaoh had, so I'm trying to say.
Right.
He could care less.
Right. Well, and what was the promise? What was the covenant that God made with Abraham? I'm going to multiply your people.
Exactly.
And they would be going against God's covenant. They would be going against the promise of God, and they feared that. Okay, we definitely don't want to do that. But what we're going to find is that God's hand is in all of it. So, I think what I wrote down here for verse 17 is I think that we have gotten to the place where we have a lot of people who don't really fear God in our own nation.
True.
We have a lot of professing Christians. How can you be a professing Christian and deliberately live outside of God's word, knowing that you're living in sin, knowing what Jesus did on the cross, knowing those things, and say, well, it's okay. I'm going to choose to do what I want. I'm going to choose to live outside of marriage with my boyfriend and my girlfriend anyway. I'm going to choose to go out and do this. I'm going to choose to use this language. I'm going to choose to act this way. I'm going to choose to live like the world. And all of these things that God says you're not to do. You know what it is? We have a lack of fear.
Yes.
And you know what that means? a lot of people don't realize the severity of God's judgment. They really don't. See, we have taught for so long what grace means, and really we've kind of presented it. I was talking to Philip about this on Friday. We have presented grace in such a way that while what we're saying is truth, we have almost made it as an excuse to go ahead and live the way you want to live, and yet you can still claim grace. And that's really not what the Bible says. Matter of fact, the Bible says the opposite of that. And Philip said, you know, you're so right. Because we have just for years have made this, oh, but we're all under grace. We're just under grace. Doesn't matter, we're under grace. And Philip said it's really scary when you think about how many people will claim to be Christians. And yet one day Jesus is going to say, I never even knew you. And they're going to say, well, what about the grace thing? And Jesus is going to say, well, yeah, grace was freely offered. But there's a lot of people who, I don't know. You can say, Lord, Lord, all you want. I don't know you. And I said, I think you're right. I said, because I think we, as pastors for a long time, misrepresented what grace is. And that's why I chose to go through the book of Galatians like we are. Because there is a difference in grace and understanding the law, why the law was given. And when you put it all together, it makes real good sense. That's why I went through 3 or 4 weeks of just understanding what is the gospel? What is the gospel of grace? What does that mean? It means that we are justified by faith. And that is so important because once you understand that, then the law comes in. And we have so many people that just say, no, we're no longer under the law, we're under grace. Well, yeah, that's true for salvation. But God still says, you're my people, and this is how I expect you to live. You're not to be like the world. You're to be a light in the darkness. You're not supposed to blend in with the darkness. There's a big difference. Big, big difference. And when you really read the letters of Paul and you go all the way through them like we're going to, you'll see that. Because Paul will tell us later on in Galatians, you should never, after he gives all these 3 or 4 chapters on what grace is, what does he say in the end? If you're a Christian, you don't live as an adulterer. You don't live as a liar and a thief and all these other things. So what is he saying? Is he saying grace or the other? Well, he is saying, yes, grace comes with salvation. But once salvation truly takes place, you don't live in the world like the world. There's a difference that comes. Very, very interesting. So here these women made a choice. We're not going to compromise God's promise to us. We're not giving in. People are willing today to take that gamble of obedience. And they say, you know what, I'll just take the heat from God. Not realizing what that means. I'll risk not coming to church. I'll risk not reading my Bible. I'll risk those things, not realizing it. You may be all right. You may be saved. But your wife and your children and the rest of your family line that's coming in the next generations, they may all be lost because of your disobedience. And that comes with part of God's judgment. But isn't it a great comfort to know that God is involved in working out his plan? Look at verse 18. It says, so the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children? Look at verse 19. And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. Oh, there's a difference. Catch that. For they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. This was not a lie.
No.
These women did not lie. You know what they said? Pharaoh says, why is it you're not doing what I told you? And they said, you got to understand, there's something that is going on that is different with the Hebrew women to all the other women. Why? Because the Hebrew women were God's people. God was working in them. And what they're saying is absolutely true. They were being honest. And they said, you know what happens? We get the call, hey, Anna is having her baby. Before we get there, the baby has already been born. That's what she said. That's what she told them. Before we can even get to the houses, the babies are already born. What do we do then? They've already cleaned the baby up. Mom's holding the baby when we get there. All we do is check for the pulse. Yep. Slap it on the rear. Yep. He's still squalling. He's good. We'll see you later. Not like the Egyptian women, where we go in and sometimes labor is long and might last for several hours or even days or whatever. No, with the Hebrew women, there's something different about them. You know what it was? God's hand was in all of it. God is working out his plan. What a great comfort, especially for us in a day like today, when we can look and see at what's going on in our nation. You know what? One thing that we can take full comfort in knowing, first and most important, is what? That I'm saved. That's something that you ought to be able to take comfort in if you are a child of God. First thing is, you know what? I'm saved. Second thing is, you know what? God has a plan, and he's working out his plan. I don't see the plan. I don't understand what all's going on. I don't know what the future may hold. I know how it ends. I know where my destination is going to be. And so as long as I know that I'm a child of God and that I know God is in the work, it's okay. All things work together for the good. Doesn't mean everything's good. That means that in the end, when God's plan is all worked out, we'll see it was good. It was for his good. Verse 20 says, therefore God dealt. What are we looking at time? Okay, we're going to make it. Verse 20, therefore God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mightily. So not only does he say, okay, I want you to, midwives, I want you to take the babies. Another time period is gone. We don't know how long. But Pharaoh notices, okay, before they were like rabbits multiplying. Now it's even more. I mean, they're like mice. They're having, is it possible for a woman to have a baby every 3 months? Because that's what it seems like. He says, what in the world is going on? You know, when I grew up, when we moved into New Guinea, great illustration, when we moved into New Guinea, they had lots of kids. There were a few families that had several children. I mean, 30 years old all the way down to babies. I mean, they would just continue to have kids, right? But here's the thing. Over half of their children, sometimes about 2/3 of their children would die from malaria or typhoid or hepatitis or some other disease because they didn't have any medication. They didn't have medicines. You know, when we moved into that tribe, they had some kids there. There were some kids, young kids there. And when we first moved in, there were a few infant deaths. There were a few of them that died within, a month or 2 months old or whatever. But my mom and dad had taken medical training when we were here in the States before we went over as missionaries. Mom and dad learned how to give shots. And when we got over there, the government, once they knew that there were missionaries out there with those tribal people, the government would supply medicine. And so every 2 months, they would drop medicine out of, like a plane would fly by, a Cessna, and they would shove these boxes out the windows. They would swoop down, and they would shove them out, and the tribal people would go out in the jungle and climb the trees and try and find the boxes. They would bring them back, and we would have medicine like penicillin, and we would have Tylenol. We would have medicine for Greeley. We would have all kinds of, medicine for malaria. Okay, just different things that they'd never had. And when they and then my mom and dad, they started doing what they called a medical clinic every day from 3 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, every day. And what we found is within a couple of years, what used to be about 5 or 6 little kids quickly turned into about 30 and then 35 little kids because none of them were dying. They were all living because when they got malaria, we had the medicine. We gave them what they needed, the chloroquine or the quinine or whatever they needed. They were able to get through it and then move on. Unbelievable. And the tribal people, they said, our tribe has never grown like this. They told our mom and dad, one thing we know is that since you guys moved into our tribe, we've almost doubled in size. And you guys have only been here a few years. Why? Because none of the kids were passing away. None of them. Even the adults. The average lifespan over there is about 30 years old because of disease and, just the hardships of life. And all of a sudden, we're having people live until they're 40 and 50 and 55 years old. And they're saying, we've never had this many senior adults in the village. This is not normal, but we love it. What a great blessing. That's kind of what was going on here. Pharaoh says, what in the world? I mean, it's like you were having children before, but now you're having so many children, we can't even keep up. So he comes up with a new game plan. A new game plan. Let's see here. So it says, verse 20, is that where we're at? Therefore, oh yeah, verse 20. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mightily. Okay, so here's the blessing. Those midwives that took a stand and said, no, we're not going to go against God's promise for our people. It says God blessed them mightily, blessed them well. And the people multiplied and grew very mightily. And it says, verse 21, and so it was because the midwives feared God, he provided households for them.
He protected.
Think about that. Who would want to have a midwife in your house when your wife is pregnant and there's a possibility it could be a son, and you know Pharaoh said, get rid of all the boys? And yet God provided people to say, you know, we'll take your midwife in. We'll take you in. We'll take you in. You just come live with us. God was pleased with their stand, and he blessed them in that way that they were able to have their own household. In one commentator, it says that they were even able to have their own kids, is what he thought that meant. Okay, verse 22, so Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born to you. So now he's moved on. Midwives, the Hebrew people are not going to do it. Now we've got to move on to my own people. His counsel, the Egyptian military. Every son who is born, you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. The plan was this: if we get rid of the boys, eventually the girls are going to marry into the Egyptian family, and they'll just eventually become Egyptian people. They'll just blend in. And the entire nation of Israel will be no more. Won't even have to worry about it. That's the plan. So, he says, let's not just kill them, but let's throw them into the river. They would drown, and then the crocodiles would be able to eat them, discard them, and their remains wouldn't even be found. Right? Because a crocodile, they digest bone and all. Everything is just gone. There's no evidence of anything then. That's what his plan was. And yet, once again, we see that the people are getting put into some hardship. God is removing his hand of protection. He's still protecting his people. But he's removing that hand just a little bit and allowing some hardships, allowing some of Satan's influence to come into those Egyptians who are saying, you know what, let's persecute these people. Let's get rid of them. Let's annihilate this family line. That's not what they were thinking, but we know that behind it, that's what Satan was thinking. Let's get rid of the Israelite nation, and then we can disrupt God's plan altogether. And so they're saying, let's do this. Let's get rid of all of these Israelites. Yet God is in the plan. He's working things out. And we can take comfort in that, and we can know, no matter what's going on around our nation right now and even around the world, we know God is in control. And he's got a promise. He's kept his promise. We know the next thing on the list is that he's going to appear in the sky one day, and he's going to call all of his children, and we're going to meet him in the air. We know that's coming. And just as Jan said, man, we can pray for that and look forward to that every day. That's something we ought to look forward to. Now, it's not something that we should look forward to just so that we're not, mistreated. Because that's why some people would say it. Well, I mean, I want to live here as long as I can so that I can see my grandkids get married, and I want to see the great-grandkids and everything else. But if it's not going to happen that way, and it's not going to be good, Jesus just come. That's the wrong attitude. Because it's really more about your own self, right? So we got to be careful about that.
He said for us to encourage each other with that, though, to know that we're going to be taken. He'll take care of us.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, we're to look forward to those things. But for the right reasons. It's not just so that we're not persecuted. Jesus said you're going to be persecuted. Matter of fact, Peter, when you read the letter of Peter, Peter says, you were actually called. God called you and saved you so that you would be persecuted. That's what he told those people. Can you imagine telling people that? Now, who wants to come forward? I just want you to know. But see, you see the difference? Now do you see what I was talking about with how we present grace? Because when you read the letters in the New Testament, none of them were saying it's going to be pie in the sky. Every one of them says it's going to be hard and it's going to cost. And it's probably going to cost everything. And for some, it may even be your life. Now, who will come? Who will come? And people came. We don't have that kind of teaching today. We have just come and you'll be saved. And once you're saved, you can live however you want. That's what a lot of people say.
It's never said take up that yoke. It's
Right.
heavy.
Yep.
It seems as though every time that this nation gets prosperous, there becomes a stumbling block, just like the Great Depression and the wars that we've had and stuff. And then here as of late, you know, we've been rather prosperous. Now look what's happened. COVID hit us, and things have changed, and it just seems that like God is trying to tell us something, but we're not listening.
Well, I think in many ways you're right. I think God is speaking, but I also think that we have to remember God has a plan. And as soon as the rapture comes, your house is not going to matter. My house is not going to matter. What happens at the White House and what they rule, that's not going to matter to me anymore. None of that's going to matter. And so
There won't be anybody in it.
once again, well,
Oh, yeah.
no, it'll be full. Right now, it'll be full. They won't even know we're
Yeah,
gone.
they won't know what
But-
happened.
But what the way we look at it, you know, is, you know, it's just basically what we're doing is we're mixing two priorities. We're saying, Jesus, we want you to come, but then we're so concerned about our nation and everything that belongs to us, we have to say, okay, well, which is which? We need to be concerned about the things of God. We need to be concerned about our nation. But I can tell you this, I'm really not overly concerned about saving America and making it great again. The Bible says every nation is going to turn against Israel. We are turning against Israel. This is prophecy. You know, I mean, could there be another great revival that takes over the nation? It could be. But you know what? It very well could be that Jesus is going to come tonight, and this place is going to completely turn against the nation of Israel, and the Antichrist is going to come right out of Ozark. It could happen. And so we just have to accept that and understand that, God, while I don't know what's going on, God, all I know is that I'm going to continue to trust you because I know you're in control. I'm going to keep looking to you. And that's how we should deal with that. Anyway, so that is the first chapter of Exodus.
See, you done a good job within an hour.
So, yeah, I tried. You guys have any questions or